Hello, everyone. My name is Olga Pasanova, the Department of International Relations and International Laboratory and World Order Studies at New Regionalism at the National Research University High School of Economics is holding its 34th session of the Eurasian online seminar. Our guest today is a leading South African expert in international relations theory, religious fundamentalism, and population movements within the developing world, Hussein Solomon. The topic of his talk will be Islam and democratization. Dr. Hussein Solomon holds a D.Litt at Phil in political science from the University of South Africa. Currently, he's senior professor and academic head of Department of Political Studies and Governance, University of Free State. His previous appointments include being executive director of the International Institute of Islamic Studies, professor and director of the Center for International Political Studies, University of Pretoria, research manager at the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, senior researcher, Institute for Security Studies, and research fellow, Center for Southern African Studies, University of the Western Cape. His research interests include conflict and conflict resolution in Africa, South African foreign policy, international relations theory, religious fundamentalism, and population movements within the developing world. And his publications have appeared in South Africa, Nigeria, the United States, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, the Russian Federation, Greece, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Egypt, Ethiopia, Israel, Lebanon, India, Bangladesh, Spain, and Japan. His most recent books include Directions in International Terrorism, Theories, Trends, and Trajectories, Terrorism in Africa, New Trends and Frontiers, Arab, Middle East, and North African countries, Exporting Global Jihad, Islamism Crisis and Democratization, Implications of the World Values Survey for the Muslim World, African Security in the 21st Century, Challenges and Opportunities, and other works. He is a member of the Academy of Sciences of South Africa, South African Academy of Science and Art. So those of you I can see who are familiar with the format, you know what to do. Those who are new to this seminar, if you'd like to participate in the Q&A session, it'll be at the very end of this, this seminar. You can write down your name and question in the chat, and you'll be called out, or your question will be read out loud. Thank you very much, Professor Solomons. We very much look forward to what you have to say to us today. Thank you.
Well, first, thank you so much for the kind words, and thank you so much for hosting me today. Let me start off perhaps on a personal note. This presentation has its origins in my own personal battles of what being a Muslim is in the 21st century, and how do I reconcile my faith with the world which I inhabit. And so, and this has been going on possibly for the better part of 2 decades. And I will be sharing with you today insights from a 2-volume study, which I co-authored with Professor Arno Tosh, and was published by Springer. That's the books that was read out by Olga just now, Islam, Crisis and Democratization being the one, and the second being the Arab MENA region on the eve of COVID-19. My special focus is on the MENA region, but this has applicability to the wider Islamic world more generally. Now, there are tectonic shifts taking place in the MENA region. And when one thinks of that, often people refer to the Abraham Accords, signed between Israel and some Arab countries. But I think the developments I'm talking about actually go far beyond that. It speaks to the changing attitudes in the region amongst ordinary people. So what are these shifting attitudes that we're talking about? I think when you look at the more assertive women's movements across countries, a Price Waterhouse Cooper survey of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt found that 2/3 of the public are in favor of government intervention in private companies to set targets for gender diversity. Algerian Muslims not wanting to fast in Ramadan, growing secular values in Turkey and Iran. So rather than focusing on government policies and that of political elites, the books draw on recent World Values Survey data sets and examines what it means for democratization, for countries in the region. So one might well ask, why this emphasis on the World Value Survey? The answer is simply because it covers 72 countries of the world, representing 4/5 of the world's population. Now, despite my drawing heavily for this presentation on the World Value Survey, I will also refer to the Pew Arab Barometer, various surveys by the BBC, as well as the various Arab youth surveys. And while we'll be looking at these so-called macro trends, I would also hone in on certain countries. I think I also want to touch on issues of Sharia and the interrelationship between political democratization and economic growth. So let me say that to you. I think the tone for this presentation could be regarded as cautious optimism when examining prospects of democratization in the Muslim world generally. So let me start off with the why a bit cautious. I think because 10% of the population in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia support the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. 50% or more of the population in Iraq, the Palestinian territories, Iran, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, Algeria, and Tunisia support Sharia law. Also 50% of the population in these countries support the death penalty for those who leave the Muslim faith. Also, in Algeria, West Bank, and Gaza, Jordan, and Iraq, 50% or more of the population is in favor of stoning people who commit adultery. And a third of the population support the honor killing of a female offender in much of the Middle East. So these are just some percentages to start the discussion rolling. 20% of the population in in Libya, Yemen, the Palestinian territories, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Algeria, Iraq, Iran, and Morocco reject having a neighbor of a different religion. And also across the region, there's widespread distrust of public institutions, such as the police and the courts. Of course, the percentage varies between countries. And I think when you look at that, it kind of suggests that the prospect for democratization is rather bleak. And when I talk about democratization, obviously, I'm not just simply talking about open elections. I'm also talking about the underlying cultural ethos needed to sustain democratic polities. But I also think that there is room for optimism. There is room to be hopeful and to believe in a better tomorrow. Because if you look at it, the long-term prognosis for Islamist parties, right, do not look good because of a values change in the Arab world as a result of processes of urbanization, modernization, globalization, all facilitated by modern technology. So Arab society, according to Malik Abdul Jabbar, is becoming more secular, more liberal, more egalitarian in its values, and actually moving away from religion, tradition, and ethnocentrism. So in the process, Arab societies are becoming more tolerant of the proverbial other, be it non-Muslims, the West, or even the State of Israel. Of course, I should qualify the State of Israel because support for recognizing Israel as the state, of course, is there, but it could also be the result of escalating tensions, as you know, between Sunnis and Shiites in the region, and thereby relegating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the back burner. But what is interesting for me when looking at these outcomes is that if you look at the works of Sifty, Wuttrich, and Schmeiler, they demonstrate that the relationship between Muslim religiosity and democratic support need not be negative. Religiously observant Muslims constitute those who espouse a more orthodox view, attempting to create a social order based on divine laws, as well as those who are more modernist in orientation and subscribe to religious pluralism and tolerance. So whereas the Muslim Brotherhood is more inclined towards the orthodox perspective, recent survey data suggests that more Muslims in the region are adopting the more modernist orientation, okay? So if you look at the Arab Youth Survey, which was conducted in 2019 and involved 15 countries in the Persian Gulf, the Levant, North Africa, and included 3,300 face-to-face interviews, it actually found that those aged between 18 and 24 years old in the region were becoming more secular in their attitudes, blaming religion and sectarianism for the region's various conflicts. 2/3 of them believe that religion is playing too large a role in the Middle East, whilst half agree that the Arab world's religious values are holding the Arab world back. So let's turn to Mohammed Shahroo, who's at the University of Damascus, in explaining this change in attitudes. He argues that the region's youth is confronted with a deep intellectual dilemma when it came to reconciling conservative teachings with the world they inhabit. In addition, he argues that access to the internet has allowed them to keep pace with worldwide developments, opening their minds to virtually all cultures and civilizations. I want to turn also to the BBC News Arabic, which also reinforced the survey conducted in the region in terms of the Arab youth, and specifically looked at the implications for organizations, Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood. So the BBC polls involved 25,000 people from Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Libya, Morocco, West Bank and Gaza, Sudan, Tunisia, and Yemen. And the results demonstrated that trust in Islamic groups and organizations has fallen drastically across the MENA region. In Jordan and Morocco, trust in the Muslim Brotherhood had declined by 20% since 2012-2013. In Sudan, support for the Brotherhood had dropped further by 25%, from 49% to a mere 24%. And even if one looks at the reformist Ennahda in Tunisia, it declined by 24%, while Palestinian support for Hamas had declined to 22% from 48% over the 2012-2019 period. I want to move away from these macro trends and go specifically into two countries. And these two countries are controlled by Islamists. The one is Iran and the other one is Turkey. So Iran claims that 99.5% of the population are Muslim. However, recent surveys published in A Conversation found that only 40% of Iranians identified themselves as Muslim. 78% of Iranians believe in God, but only 37% believe in life after death, and only 30% believe in heaven and hell. Around 20% said that they did not believe in God. A Pew survey found that only 12% of Muslims in Turkey desire Sharia law to be the official law in the country. A 2019 poll of Turkish youth found that they were less religiously conservative, less likely to fast, pray, or if female, cover their hair. A 2020 poll found that only 12% of Turks trust Islamic clerics. What this suggests is that both Turkish President Erdogan and the Ayatollahs in Iran are essentially out of step with their own population. The results of these and other surveys, however, I think is far more nuanced and indicate a desire that Muslims also want more Islam in their public space and also more democracy in their polities, if you look at some of the findings out of Pew. So there's a body of Muslim opinion which wants both Islam and greater political freedom in their lives, and they see no contradiction between Islam and democracy. So the challenge then is to indigenize both democracy and secularism within the Muslim world, and not view it through a Eurocentric lens. So in marrying the universal norms of democracy with the particular sociocultural context that Islamic societies find themselves, I would like to maybe use the words of Sudipta Kaviraj, and I'm now going to quote her, and this is what she had to say: the process of modernity is universal, but these processes are realized through a trajectory of historical events which are specific to each society. So in attempting to indigenize Islamic democracy, I also want to quote the democratic theorist T.F. Rodin, and he had this to say, and I'm going to quote him now. In case of any confusion, liberal democracy does not mean American democracy. Just like modernization is not westernization. The liberal in liberal democracy must be stripped of any preconceived ethnocentric notions if it is to have any analytical power in a more inclusive political science. Liberalism need not be confused with something only viable for the English-speaking world, Western Europe, or Japan. It is quite okay to reject America's penchant for firearms, her lack of universal healthcare, or her environmental policies, and still keep basic liberal tenets like individual liberties, habeas corpus, or institutions of government other than the executive. This is what he had to say. So that's unquote there. So for the rest of the paper, what I want to do is deal with the mechanisms or the operationalization. How does an Islamic democracy exist in reality? Okay, how is this possible? Okay, so in order to answer that question, we need to start off with a simple caveat. The Western notion of a separation between religion and the political sphere hardly exists in reality. Let me repeat that. The Western notion of separation between religion and the political sphere hardly exists in reality. Jürgen Habermas pointed out that ideas of freedom, democracy, and human rights emanate from the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. After all, research undertaken by Jonathan Fox proves that the so-called separation between religion and state hardly exists. Fox surveyed 152 countries and according to him, proved a full separation of religion and state only exists in one country, and for him that is the United States. I personally doubt that it's even existing in the United States. So the question is, how can faith and democracy peacefully coexist? Let me turn to the work here of Stepan and Lenz, who proposed that what was needed was a significant degree of differentiation between religion and state. This situation of differentiation is summed up as the twin tolerations. So in a country that lives by these twin tolerations, religious authorities do not control democratic officials who are acting constitutionally, while democratic officials do not control religious actors as long as these respect other citizens' rights. So from that, many patterns among the state, religion, and society are compatible with the twin tolerations set out by Stepan and Lenz. So there are, in other words, multiple secularisms. Now, there are some innovative Muslim thinking around these issues, okay? And one can go back to 1998. 1998, 50 Turkish intellectuals from different ideological persuasions came to the conclusion that God's ontological sovereignty is compatible with the political sovereignty of the people. Such a position stands in sharp contrast to the Islamist position of an all-encompassing divine sovereignty, reflected in the phrase Islam din wal dawla. Islam is religion and state. In the 1990s, new religious thinkers in Iran questioned the ruling clerical establishment, asserting the right of individuals to make their own moral judgments on the basis of reason and their own individual conscience. This is an important development for the future of freedom and democracy in the MENA region, since the state was often negatively conceived to prevent people from engaging in sin. So this is more like the conception of St. Augustine's city of God and less like the ancient Greek position of politics. So these innovative Islamic scholars have also explained that Sharia is not a monolithic Islamic system. Okay, so when you talk of Sharia, you need to understand that there is fiqh, which focuses on personal morality, and then siyasa, which focuses on rulers serving the public good. So there's personal morality, fiqh, and there's siyasa, which is when rulers serve the public good. Okay, what is important to understand about siyasa is that siyasa does not have its origins in Islamic scripture, but rather from good governance principles, more generally with an emphasis on the with an emphasis on the public good, or what's called maslaha amma. Okay. Now, Sherazad Rahman and Hussein Askari developed something which they termed an Islamicity index, which was based on 113 Quranic injunctions pertaining to the public good. Then they correlated this with data sets from the UN Human Development Index, the World Bank, and other sources. According to this Islamicity index, the top 10 most Islamic countries in the world, okay, the top 10 most Islamic countries in the world are Ireland, Denmark, Luxembourg, Sweden, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Finland, and Norway. Muslim majority countries, by contrast, did poorly, with Saudi Arabia securing the 91st position, Qatar at 112, Morocco 120, Egypt 129, Iran 139, and Sudan 190. Now, let me turn to more recent developments, okay? There is something called post-Islamism, and there's also something called civil Islam. Now, if you look at Middle East studies, one of the doyens of Middle East studies was a scholar named Bernard Lewis, and he put forth an argument that often, or for a long time, was regarded as part of established doctrine on Middle East studies, that Islam cannot be democratized, that Muslims and Arabs cannot view themselves as independent from the divine. Now, such a perspective, however, ignores the skepticism, the rationalism, the humanism in Arab history, if one looks at the work by Phil Zuckerman. Zuckerman quotes numerous Arab scholars who reflected these traditions historically. There was the 9th century skeptic Ibn al-Rawandi, who negated Islam as he advocated free thought. Also in the 9th century, there was the critical rationalism of Muhammad al-Warraq, who doubted the existence of a God and the veracity of divine revelation. There was also Muhammad al-Razi, who advanced the study of the natural sciences as he questioned the divinity of the Quran. And then there was the secular humanism of Omar Khayyam in the 11th century, and the 12th century towering intellect of the founding father of secular philosophy, Averroes. So tapping into the secular humanist and critical rationalist tradition, Muslim scholars are increasingly examining prospects for a post-Islamist future. If you look at Asef Bayat, he described a present where Islamism increasingly loses legitimacy on account of their system's contradictions and failures, okay? So the Quran is a wonderful book, and it's, if you're a Muslim, it's a divine book, and so forth. But is it a template for governance? Compelled by a combination of these anomalies and societal pressure, these Islamists had to reinvent themselves. And this reinvention is revolutionary in that it entails a qualitative shift in their ideological position. Whilst Islamism is characterized by universalism, exclusivism, obligation, and a monopoly of religious truth, post-Islamist movements stress ambiguity and multiplicity, inclusion and compromise in principles and practice, and responsibility. It is important to acknowledge that this post-Islamism does not represent the jettisoning of religion in the public sphere, as in France, for example. Rather, post-Islamism refers to an inclusive religiosity, one which is compatible with liberal democratic norms. Ali Eteraz notes that post-Islamism recognizes that politics, rather than religion, provides for the welfare of this life. These changes already started happening in the mid-1990s, I think, when the Al-Wasat Party in Egypt was formed as an alternative to both militant Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. Whilst Wasat regarded itself as an Islamic party, it welcomed secularists and Christians into its fold, rejected religious or gender discrimination, was opposed to an extra constitutional body of clerics, as in Iran, which can veto laws and supports the separation of powers. Tunisia's Islamists, in the form of Ennahda, has increasingly distanced itself from its Muslim Brotherhood origins and is recasting itself as a Muslim Democratic Party in the vein of Germany's Christian Democratic Union. So in the November 2019 elections, for example, Ennahda's candidate for Prime Minister, Habib Gemli, made it clear that the selection criteria for any cabinet members would be efficiency and integrity, not party or religious affiliation. I think another dimension of what's happening in the MENA region is highlighted by the emergence of civil Islam. Contrary to Islamism, which is state-centric and a political ideology, civil Islam focuses on the individual Muslim's spiritual development and the promotion of the general conditions necessary for human society to flourish. So these include religious freedom, human rights, economic development, rule of law, communal harmony, and social justice. Now, whilst not involved in party political activities, those Muslims subscribing to civil Islam do not endorse adopting a hermit's stance to the world. Their participation, however, takes the form of civic activism, from child welfare to educational foundations. Now, some critics have pointed out that there's an inherent danger here regarding the nature of the civil Islam, since they argue that many Islamist organizations have made inroads into local populations with their civic activism. It is always difficult, however, to assess the true intentions of such organizations. Despite the challenges and hidden dangers on the basis of the tremendous value change across the MENA region, I think the demise of political Islam in the long term is occurring. And this might well herald the beginning of a more stable, prosperous, and open polities for the long-suffering inhabitants of this blighted region. Let me state something that I haven't touched on. And it's as follows. There can be no liberal democracy in the Muslim world without liberal economic policies. And I want to conclude this talk with a discussion on this point. The esteemed economist Eric Weed proved that economic growth precedes democracy, even in non-Western settings. He pointed out that India lagged behind much of the East Asian economies until the 1990s. Following structural reforms, not only did India's economy take off, but so did its political reform agenda. I don't think things are going very well right now in terms of India at this particular moment in time, but democracy is not a linear process. Turning to the Muslim world, Weed notes that with the exception of a few oil-rich, population-poor countries, most Islamic countries consist of a patchwork of mostly poor countries. Consider here the following. The combined GDP of 57 Muslim countries is under $2 trillion. By contrast, the GDP for the US is 10.4 trillion, China 5.7 trillion, Japan 3.5 trillion, India $3 trillion. To put it differently, whilst constituting 22% of the world's population, Muslims contribute less than 5% of the world's GDP. In the 2017-2018 Arab Opinion Index, which surveyed 18,830 respondents from 11 countries, from 11 Arab countries, a paltry 1.39% of respondents viewed the economic conditions in their respective countries positively. This was hardly surprising, given the fact that 30% of citizens also live in need, meaning that their household incomes do not cover their recurrent monthly expenditure. Moreover, a third of respondents regard unemployment, poverty, and price inflation as their most pressing challenges. The youth, of course, often bears the brunt of this economic catastrophe. This served as a catalyst to their resorting to the street during the Arab Spring and repeatedly since then. Such economic stagnation, however, also serves to bolster Islamists who make use of legitimate economic grievances in order to advance their anti-democratic Islamist order. What then is desperately needed in the Muslim world to halt the Islamist juggernaut whilst promoting a liberal democratic future is the adoption of technology and significant investments in human capital, human development, and creating the conditions for the private sector to thrive. Thank you very much for listening to me. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Alexandra is going to take it from here. Thanks very much.
Okay.
That's very insightful.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I'm holding the Q&A session right now. So please, those who want to ask questions, write down them in the chat, and I will read them out loud and give you the microphone. And as far as I have the right to ask the question first, maybe Olga, you have any questions?
I just have a small comment. I'm really fascinated by the statistics that you've gathered on if you could repeat that, the most Muslims in a way, right? So you named some of the countries like Norway, Denmark, European countries, yeah? So this is, I think this gives us a really fresh new perspective. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. So there is the question from Daniel Kate about the prospects of secularization, and I'm going to turn on the microphone. Okay. Daniel, is it possible to turn it on? Okay, so I'm reading the question out loud. How do you see the prospects of secularization for smaller ME states that are caught in the power politics of Iran and Saudi Arabia, both being states that promote Islamic values with hard cash? Thank you.
Should I respond to each of the questions? Is that how we're going to do it?
Yeah, if possible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, as I said, I kind of have a problem maybe with the term secularism because it's just so ingrained in terms of Western political theorizing and so forth. And as I said, it has to be indigenized in the region. But more importantly, in terms of your question, you are absolutely right. I live in Africa, and you can see large Middle East foundations, promoting their Islamist ideology. So we have the likes of your Al-Shabaabs in Somalia, your Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, operating the Sahel in West Africa, and Boko Haram, and now, of course, Islamic State and their various franchises. It's not going to be easy. I think because certain people also dress up their national interests in the sort of religious rhetoric and push that. But what I would say to you is that there's a need for any such twin tolerations as opposed to secularism and this more modernist, this more moderate Islam to be actually coming out from the region itself, okay, from the people itself, from the ground. And if it doesn't, it's not going to have resonance. But at the same time, what do you do when the message is not coming out so much, when when your religious bodies, when your sermons and so on is being written elsewhere, okay, and is being pushed. And then to make matters worse, let's say that you are in a country which is already authoritarian, okay? I'm not saying that the process is going to be easy. And I think there are multiple points of intervention. But I would argue the issue of economic inclusivity, political inclusivity, creating a caring state, because often your more militant forms of Islam comes about as a result of an uncaring state in the region or now in the polity. So they actually go to the mosque or to the local Islamist foundation, which is caring for their health needs or for their educational needs, to get young people to marry, and so forth and so on. And so the state needs to play a more caring role. And so all of these things have to be met. So it's a difficult question because the answer is not an easy one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I would like to ask the question by myself. So according to the statistics that you have, Professor, read it out loud recently, the majority of Islamic states are very poor. So they have very poor economy and low level of living standards. And according to the theory of political science, there are possible risks and perspectives of growing populism in these states. So does this trend really takes place in these countries? And if so, what are the future prospects of populism transformation? So are we going to see this populism in the states, or whether are we going to see some transformation to more transparent political processes in these countries? So thank you.
Look, let me take the case of Saudi Arabia, right? So many of the Western states have lauded Saudi Arabia because Prince Mohammed bin Salman seems to be this reformer and so forth and so But if you look at the number of princes, if you look at the nepotism taking place, if you look at the fact that the poorest of the poor do not benefit from the oil wealth of the nation and so forth, this breeds, if you want to call it an Islamist populism or a discourse against the state. You know, one of the principles, if you go back to like the Muslim Brotherhood thinkers, you know, you would see that the issue of justice is actually quite key, and that the state actually exists there to ensure. And if you go look at the first four Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs in Islam, and the stories about them ensuring that the wealth was equitably distributed amongst the people and so on. And that's the ideal. And therefore, Islamism has an appeal when people are left out and when they are excluded. Okay, but remember that this particular survey that I was talking about in terms of the fact that the Muslim population is 22%, okay, and of the world's population, but they only contribute 5% of the GDP. So it's not just simply in terms of the Middle East, it's globally. As I said, I've done extensive work in terms of Africa. And if you take Boko Haram, right? I mean, there's always been an Islamist insurgency in northern Nigeria, and it goes back to 1802, when Uthman Dan Fodio started his jihad, okay? But if you look at the disparity between the largely Christian South and the largely Muslim North, okay, the economic disparity, you can understand why. I'm not justifying it, I'm totally opposed to it, but you can understand why Boko Haram has such a wide appeal. If you turn to Mali again, there's a huge economic disparity, you know, between the North and the South. For example, in Kidal, I mean, you are talking about 94% unemployment. Okay, so when you see all of these Islamists, you know, gaining momentum, you can understand why. And I think there's been so much of emphasis, you know, being placed upon counterterrorism, okay, counterterrorism, and so on, when actually the emphasis should have been put on good governance, on creating inclusive political societies, in terms of creating more equal societies. My own country, South Africa, just got the dubious reputation this past week of being the world's most unequal society on the planet. Okay, and so you can see the resentment and so forth. And so as long as you don't have that, as long as there's this disparities and this concentrations of wealth, you are going to have problems, and it's still going to, despite the positive intellectual development by Islamists, I think it is something which is not going to go away, precisely because there's a cause for them to rally against. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Anne Phillips. I'm turning the mic on. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Professor Solomon, for your very interesting presentation. And I couldn't write fast enough to get all the statistics down, so I hope, but I noted the sources. So my question is the democratic backsliding in Europe, in the United States, in any way affecting the dynamics that you described in the predominantly Muslim world, in MENA, and so on? And it links in also to the point you just made about growing disparities of wealth in the United States, in Europe. And in Europe, I would say the democratic backsliding in some countries in particular, based on resurgence of nationalism, which is by definition an exclusive phenomenon, the Hungarian tradition, the Polish, etc. In the US, it's translating in somewhat different ways. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your response.
Thank you very much. I haven't really worked on issues of democratization in terms of the Western world per se, but let me maybe say this, that there have been articles being written, especially in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, about democratic backsliding as a result of the surveillance state, okay? Because you need to monitor those, or you have to ensure vaccinations and so forth and so on. So there's been articles about that, but so let me come back maybe towards the Western world and how it relates to the Middle East. I mean, for a long time, as you know, Western states actually have supported authoritarian leaders across much of the Muslim world, which of course resulted in resentment towards the West. And you don't need to be an Islamist, you know. I mean, you can go back to Iran and the coup against Mossadegh. But you know what is very interesting for me in terms of the Western states is, so let me turn to Saudi Arabia, okay? So Saudi Arabia, there's a celebration in terms of Western states, in terms of the media. Oh, guess what? Saudi women are allowed to drive a car, okay? But now if you compare that to what happened to the Saudi journalist Khashoggi being, you know, brutally killed in a Turkish in a consulate, in a Saudi consulate in Turkey. How do you marry these things? Okay, for Islamism to eventually disappear completely, and so forth, what you really need is the opening up of the democratic space and the economic space. And I want, I mean, you know, there's quite a lot of corruption, so there's an interrelationship between the politics and the economics. And what's been happening is many of these Middle Eastern states are just being allowed to carry on with these atrocities. So to hand you an example, yesterday, a Muslim country, Sudan, we had, my department had a webinar yesterday, okay? And what's happening in terms of the military junta, in terms of Sudan, is terrible. However, Sudan, you know, signed an agreement with Israel, right? It joined up with the Abraham Accords, and suddenly it's given a free pass, okay? And that's what's been happening. And I think that will just fuel more resentment, resentment against the West. It will fuel further the Islamist resentment, you know, in terms of this. And for the Middle East to actually have a chance at both democratization and economic prosperity, the various princes and kings and emirs will literally have to commit political suicide, and they will not do it on their own. Okay, so pressure has to come to bear on them. But then there's a little issue called national interest. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, I'm reminding again for those who haven't heard about it. So please, those who want to ask a question, please write down in the chat. And I have one question wrote by the person who has already left, who asks about the cost. Oh, of course.
Could I have a question first, because I need to leave a bit early, so sorry. For Professor Solomon. Well, I'm interested in why we're talking about democratization at all, because I think, well, I know frankly very little about Islam, but my feeling is, from what I hear, is that I mean, the very fundamentals of Islam are based on, well, let's say the ideal state in Islam has always been historically a theocratic state. I don't know the theology of Islam very well, but I have a feeling that, at least as a historian, that we know a lot of Islamic states, and the ideal of it was a state where there is no difference or division between the state power and the secular power, I would say, and the spiritual power. While the whole idea of democracy is, of course, both Western and Christian. For example, it's Western because, as we know, it was created. Well, it appeared in ancient Greece, and of course, first Greek thinkers were not very fond of democracy, but of course they thought that the state officials were kind of were not spiritual leaders, but were kind of servants of the generally political people, what they call the citizens, and you can match this ideal with Christianity, because in Christianity you have this the division between spiritual authority and generally the kind of religious world or spiritual world and secular world. Jesus Christ himself famously spoke about it. But in Islam, it's a bit different. So don't you think that, the Islamic states will not necessarily be democratized? Maybe they will find some other form of government, because if you don't want to democratize, you usually don't do it. And that's the question. I don't know many Islamic countries actually in the current world. I mean, what country can you call democratic? I mean, more or less, Indonesia, for example, perhaps to a certain extent Malaysia, but that's it. But Islam there is quite in Southeast Asia is generally quite liberal. We know this writings of first democratic president of Indonesia, what's his name, was Wahid, I think, who actually accepted these democratic ideas. But there are very few thinkers like that. So my question is generally, should we expect Islamic countries to democratize in general?
Thank you very much, Professor Lucan, for your question. The thing is that when you're talking about democracy, what are we really talking about? And as I said, democracy will have to be indigenized in terms of the Muslim countries, right? And more than just Muslim countries, as you said, Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. And the kind of Islam there is very different from that practice, for example, in terms of Saudi Arabia. So when we're talking about democracy, we are talking about issues of accountability, we are talking about consultation, all of these things. And these things do have resonance in terms of Islamic history and as well as in terms of the origins of Islam. So if you go back to when the Prophet Muhammad passed away in 632, right, of the Christian era, as you know, there was divisions in terms of who was to succeed him. Some believed it should be his son-in-law and cousin, who was Ali, but the majority voted for Abu Bakr. So that was a democratic decision for him to be chosen. Of course, I do agree with you that for a long time, for a long time. And I would say even now, the overwhelming majority of Muslim countries are authoritarian and they are autocratic and they are supposedly theocratic. But I don't think that is, I think there are specific cultural reasons for it. And of course, the political elites don't want to give up power. But then let's look at the age of Islam versus Christianity. Christianity, of course, is a bit older than Islam. In fact, I would say to you that Islam is roughly the same age as Christianity was when Martin Luther put his 95 Thesis on Wittenberg Chapel and started the Protestant Reformation. For a long time, Europe was theocratic. I mean, the Pope controlled kings and had armies at his disposal and so forth. So I think just because the current state of Islam is one of authoritarian regimes, maybe I took too many happy pills, but I live in hope of a tomorrow which is not one controlled by a prince or an emir or a king, but one where people can expect accountable government, where they can expect a caring government, and they can expect to have some say in terms of choosing who their leader is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one more question, if you don't mind. It concerns actually the whole theory of international relations right now. And on our faculty, we have studied the non-Western theories of international relations. So as far as I don't know much about Islamic theories, are there any prospects of, when we speak about democratization in Islamic countries, are there any prospects of transformation of the whole international relations theory as these countries bring something new in terms of Islam and Islamic values into the international relations? Are there any prospects of creating and developing non-Western theories of international relations in these countries or not? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's also a difficult one, but I will try to answer it. So you know, I mean, you have your whole classical realism, you know, going back to Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War. And then Machiavelli and Hobbes and so on, Morgenthau, and you have the rise of neo-realism, Kenneth Waltz and John Mearsheimer and so on. You have your liberal internationalism, which came to the fore after the end of World War I, with its emphasis on democracy, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and then of course, as you know, developed further in terms of being more scientific with the so-called behavioral revolution in the 50s and the 60s. And then of course you have new ones, you know, or maybe not so new, your Marxism, your feminism, your green theories, and so forth. Let me make a statement which I think I'm going to be criticized for, but I think one of the nice things about academia is that you can put your head out and, well, just take the criticism. I think Islamic, I mean, of course, one can look at the various, one can theorize on Islamic relations with states as they went on and so forth. But I would say this to you, in Islam, if you take the Quran and so on, it's not so much state relations, but it actually lends itself towards globalization, because it talks of an ummah, global community of believers. Now, and the point I've been trying to make here is that I accept the point of Professor Lucan about the authoritarianism in Islamic states and so on. But I've always been a globalist. And I would like to see not so much Western and non-Western, and the Islamic world and the Western world and so on. I would like to see us focus more on theorizing on the global. But in order for us to theorize on a new international relations, okay, all of us have to own global governance, okay, all of us. So it can't be dominated by the West or by America or Russia or China or a grouping of states, okay? We all have to own it. I say sometimes to my students, if we discovered Martians and they decided to invade us tomorrow, we will all stand up as Homo sapiens, as earthlings, okay? And there are so many challenges that confront us that there's a need for new international relations. But for that to take place, it will have to be inclusive, not only in terms of politically, but also economically and socioculturally. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that on this optimistic note, we are actually finishing our seminar today because there are no more questions in the chat. Thank you very much, Professor Solomon, for your interesting lecture, and we are very honored to have you here today. And for others, and for the audience, please, just look out in the email. We are going to send more invitations in our future seminars on Eurasian online seminar. And thank you very much, Professor Solomon, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.